Hi, welcome to Chad's Silversmithing. Today, before we get started, I wanted to ask you if you'd subscribe to my channel and like this video before we get going. And if you find it useful at the end, would you consider sharing it with someone else? Thanks. Today, I thought, wouldn't it be nice to make a real pretty dragonfly that involves some of the vein work that's in the wings of the dragonfly to kind of make it stand out as kind of a showpiece? And so that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to use a little piece of dichroic glass and a piece of dyed purple turquoise for parts of the body, and then fill out the rest of it with sterling silver. So let's get going. Okay, I have here the two stones I was talking about. I have a little tiny dichroic glass that's kind of round with a little purple hue to it, unless you look at it from the side, in which case it looks kind of greenish yellow. And then I have this dyed purple turquoise. Something I've seen a lot more on the market lately is dyed turquoise, and I'm not sure why, but it is pretty attractive. So we'll make use of it, and we'll come up with kind of a cool design, I hope. So first things first, we're going to make bezels for these guys. And I'm going to use 3/16 inch bezel, which I do for most things. So this is going to be near the head, although this is not actually going to be the head. And this is going to be much of the body, and that's going to have a little bit of a tail coming off of there too. I'll need to make a circle that has a little cutout of it to put on here, and then I'll solder a couple of balls on it. Then we'll start working on the wings. I'm actually going to do something I don't do very often, but in this case it kind of calls for it. I normally use 26 gauge sheet for the bottoms of bezels, but in this case I'm going to have wings that are soldered right to the base of this bezel here, and if I have little flimsy sheet there and I have these big wings coming off of there, it's not going to give them a lot of support. The bezel itself doesn't have a lot of structure to it, so I want something pretty solid at the base where I can solder those wires to, so that it's a little bit stiffer. And same way, there's going to be a tail coming off of here, and this will be attached to this by a couple of balls. And so I want this bottom to be relatively thick as well. So I'm going to go ahead and use thick 18 gauge silver on this. So. Push these up against the edges. As long as they're touching the side and the bottom, we're good. One of the things that is another reason I use thin bottom for the bezel generally, not only to save weight and money, But when you're soldering a thicker piece of sheet to a little fine bezel like this, the disparity in mass makes it really hard to get the piece of sheet, which has a lot more mass in it than the bezel does, up to temperature. Since it's laying underneath the bezel, and the bezel kind of protects it from the heat a little bit. And so the bezel, people have a tendency to melt the bezel before they ever get the bottom piece up to temperature. So you got to kind of very carefully try to pump the heat into the bottom piece without affecting the bezel too much. So you have to do some creative maneuvering with the flame. So see if I'm up to it today. What I was doing with the tweezers there is occasionally, if I don't have the sheet perfectly flat, there's areas where the bezel is not in contact with the bottom part, and so solder is reluctant to run through empty space like that. So if you put a little downward pressure on it so it's in contact with the sheet, the already melted solder will wick its way along the bottom edge a little better. So sometimes putting a little light pressure on parts where it's not running will help. However, be cautious when you do that, because when the bezel is hot like that, it becomes very fragile, and a little bit of pressure can cause it to just kind of crumble or tear. So you got to be kind of gentle when you do that. So, all right, so we'll cool those off and trim the edges off of these guys. So make a couple balls here. Here's a little free piece of advice. I used to, when I first started, the solder joint on the side of the bezel where we soldered the two pieces together, I used to try and put it in a spot where you couldn't see it, but then I realized it's really hard to polish in a lot of those spots. So you couldn't really smooth it out with a polishing wheel or with the Dremel at all. So anymore, I put the solder joint somewhere where it's easier to reach. I go over on the side here, and just have confidence that you're going to be able to clean it up well enough to where it's invisible. Usually works out pretty well. For the rest of the tail, I sketched out a little bit of what we're doing here. Got this stone bezel right here, this bezel right here. So I'll need a little bit of a tail. I'm going to use this stuff, but I'm going to wrap another piece of twisted wire around it and solder them together to give it a little more character. And then I'm going to cut a circle a little bit bigger than this guy, and then I'll mount a couple of balls after I cut out a slice of the circle so I can butt it right up against there. I could have actually made this bigger piece of sheet and then just trimmed it down that way, but I usually get a better circle if I actually cut it out, or I use a disc cutter, which I have over there. So next step will be getting this stuff put together. So. If you're wondering, I think this is two pieces of 14 gauge round wire twisted together. Then these little ones are 20 gauge, I believe, twisted together. So, twisted wire has a tendency to soak up a lot of solder because there's a lot of surface area. Look at this. Piece too big. It's not straight. I'm going to round the end so it's not too pokey. Okay, next step is to start building the wings and the head. I'll probably do the head first. Okay, so I found a little piece of reticulated silver just to give it some texture to make it stand out a little bit. But now, I'm going to cut a semicircle out of here. And if you want to know how I cut this disc out, I used a little disc cutter, and at some point or another I'll put a link up here to show you how to use a disc cutter. But there's already a link, or there will be already a link once I publish this video showing how to reticulate silver. So check that out. Make a couple of little eyeballs here. Sometimes balls are tricky to solder down. I'm going to add a little bit of solder to this one. This one I'm pretty sure stuck down, but this one I'm not 100% sure we have a good solder joint. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a little bit more solder in there. I had initially sweat some solder onto the balls so they were pretty much covered. Okay, let that cook for a little bit, and I'm going to take a break, and then I'll come back and make some wing. I'm going to use 14 gauge for the outer part of the wings here, and I'll use 18 gauge for the inner designs, the veins that go through there. So the next steps are just going to mostly be getting the outer wing shaped. Let's see, I drew this one, and I didn't like the way this one was coming out, so I moved down here and drew it down there. So we'll see how they come together. But so now I'm just going to start shaping those. So. So these will be the two back ones. This one and the opposite one, and these will be the forward wings. So what I'll probably do for the sake of the length of the video is I'll do one of the wings, one of the front wings and one of the side wings, and then I won't film doing the other two, but we'll come back and I'll show you how to solder them on and put some fine guns on it. So we'll get shaping here. I think I did the wrong one. I think this is the front one and this is the back one, so I'll just modify it a little bit. That's pretty close. Shaped. start adding some interior veining. Get going on that. Using a little bit smaller pieces of solder during adding the details in the wings here. One thing I should have mentioned, when you're doing stuff like this, you always want to make sure it's laying pretty flat. And I almost forgot to check that. There's the first one. Okay, we're going on the second rear wing. Let's see where we're going here now. So I'll do the other two wings off camera so you don't have to watch me do the same thing twice. Okay, finished the other two wings. So what we have here right now is starting to look like that. We're going to attach them right up like there. Let's start with these guys. I'm going to have to let this cool down for a minute so I can bend the wings a little bit so it'll fit into my jar that I use for pickles. So let that cool for a minute so I can bend them. The next things that I'm going to do are going to put findings on this. Generally, this is a pretty big piece, and so I usually make it a combo pendant pin. So let's let that cool. I'm going to make a simple hidden veil for a pendant for that. And we'll just solder it onto the back of the head so you can run a chain through it. And I think what I'll use for that is this 8 gauge half round. And then round nose pliers. I'm going to put the, I'm going to make kind of a U shape here. So just like that. Cut it off. Okay, so what I'm going to do to make this easy to stick to the back, I'm going to pre-melt some solder on the ends of both of these here, and then I'll flip the pendant upside down on a place where nothing can drop out, like the how they use this, which is called a magnesia block. So I'm gonna try and put it right about there. Hopefully get it straight. Getting it on there straight is usually the hardest part. So I decided to go ahead and put a pin back on this so that it can be both a pin and a pendant. And I'm going to do kind of a double pin that has a little tube that acts as a hinge. So I have this tube that I soldered to a piece of square wire. I'm going to solder that right there. This will act as a pin that goes through there and bends on both sides, and then I have a clasp that I made like this out of a little piece of sheet. I think it's 22 gauge, and that'll be where the pins spring back and hold. So and that'll go kind of down here, just like that. And that way a person can wear it as a pendant or a pin. So the other thing I was going to show you today is when you have a piece of wire, silver wire, that you want to be stiff and springy. For instance, these pins on the back, you don't want them to be all squishy and soft like annealed silver can be. So what you can do to pretty quickly work harden this kind of wire is I bent both ends just a little bit. And if I grab each of the pliers and you twist over and over again like this, structurally the wire stays straight, but internally it's twisting this and it's torquing the metal and causing it to become stiffer and stiffer. So I can actually get it pretty springy. I just keep doing this for a while. With any work hardening though, if you do it for too long, it'll eventually stress in one spot and break somewhere. So we don't want it quite that hard. So, but as this goes, this gets stiffer and stiffer. Starting to get pretty hard, so I think I'm going to stop there. But first off, let's get these soldered on. And I think probably I will, after I get these soldered on, I will pickle the whole thing for a while to get it all cleaned up. Clean it up with a Dremel a little bit, and I may do a little pre-polishing before I put the stones in, just to make sure that I don't damage the stones. When you polish something as big and complex as this, you have to get at it from a lot of angles. And so I'm going to try not to, or to try to do the bulk of the polishing before I put the stones in. And then I'll put the stones in and then I'll finish it up and I'll show you the final result. So I use a pickle jar as a pickle jar, and since this is kind of big, I'm going to have to wait till it cools off until I can bend those wings up a little bit, and I'll heat it up again and toss it in here. Something I haven't talked about is that I use cold pickle, and many people use a pickle pot that has heated pickle because it works a little bit faster, but you don't have to do that. I've been using cold pickle for years. It takes a little bit longer to clean things up, but if you throw it in while it's still warm and it sizzles a little bit, it speeds it up a bit. So generally a half an hour to 45 minutes, and it'll get nice and cleaned up, and then you can go on with whatever your next stage is. I went ahead and did most of the polishing, and I set the stones here. The last real thing I need to do other than some cleanup polishing is to put the little pin back through here. So I have a little polishing compound in the tube, but I think what I'm going to do, I've made some marks about wide enough at the center of this double-headed pin that I created. So I'm going to make a sharp bend. One of those is like that. Stick it through here. See if I can't get a nice sharp bend on the other side here. Pin like that. One side in, the other side in, just like that. Cool. I may trim these just a little bit shorter and file the ends a little down so they don't stick out. But I think overall, that's how it's going to end up looking. The last step that I usually do is gently kind of bend these wings upwards a little bit, so they're more of a kind of a natural thing like that. But that's going to be our dragonfly.